If you could start out by telling me your name
My name is Lloyd Aubry.
and where were you born? Just a little bit of history about your life.
I was born in San Mateo, California in 1950, and I grew up on the peninsula and went to college on the peninsula as well.
All right, so I'm going to ask you some questions about the Vietnam War. When and how did you first learn about the war?
I probably first heard about the war when I was in high school. I was in high school from 1964 to 1968. There was obviously a lot of talk about the Vietnam War during the presidential campaign of 1964 between Lyndon Johnson and Barry Goldwater. And Johnson tried to run as something of a peace candidate and portrayed Barry Goldwater as someone who might use atomic weapons in Vietnam, and due to that, Johnson scored a landslide in that election, but then inconsistently with what he had been saying in the campaign, he began to expand the war in Vietnam, which continued to go poorly, and then in early 1968, he announced that he wasn't going to run for president again.
Mm-hmm. And when you were in high school, were you, especially during that election, were you involved in it at all? Was it a hot topic for you and your classmates?
Not particularly.
Not particularly. Okay. Were you involved in the draft at all?
Well, every kid of my age during the 60s was involved with the draft. The way it worked is, at an age, I can't remember what it was, if it was 16 or 17 when you were in high school, you had to go down to the local draft board and register. And then when you graduated from high school, and I think as if you were over 18, you were subject to the draft unless you had a deferment. And anyone who went to college was entitled to a student deferment, so that's what I got. And that lasted all the way through college.
And did you have any classmates who were drafted?
There might have been some, but I didn't know them.
Okay. And do you have any relatives that were involved in the Vietnam War at all?
None of them that I know of actually went into military service. I think, a number of us were involved in protests or demonstration, my brothers and my cousins.
And what were your views on the Vietnam War?
I don't think I'd really thought all that deeply about the war. I don't think I felt all that strongly about the war for a long time. I was probably kind of a lukewarm supporter because I hadn't thought about it very much and because the government was doing it, so it must be okay. And then as it dragged on and on and on, it became clear that it was unwinnable or we weren't willing to commit the resources to win. And so at that point, you got to ask yourself, why are American kids continuing to die in a war that nobody's going to win? And so at some point you got to cut your losses and get out. And I think a lot of people began to feel that though that is what happened, it took a lot longer than it should have taken.
Yeah. And how transparent was the government's running of the war?
Well, I think everybody at first thought and believed what the government was telling them about the war and all of these body counts and all of these incursions and invasions and offensives that were somehow leading to what General Westmoreland called the light at the end of the tunnel. But it became clear, especially after the release of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg, the New York Times, that we had been told a bunch of lies about the war, and that in fact much of what we'd been told was untrue, that there were inflated body counts, and the war was actually going rather poorly.
Mm-hmm. And at that point, did you attend a lot of protests for the Vietnam War?
I wouldn't say I attended a lot of protests. I mean, I didn't attend any protests, I don't think, off of the Stanford campus. There were a couple of protests that I specifically remember. One where there was a group of us who put ourselves between the more radical protesters and the police because there was clearly some kind of intention to foment violence and bring about some kind of martyr situation, and so a bunch of us sat between them. And then there were other situations where there were protests going on, and there was a fear that there might be some property destruction, so tear gas canisters were thrown, and I smelled tear gas. I won't go so far as to say I was gassed, but I could certainly smell it and was certainly running away from it.
And do you think that the Vietnam War had a positive or negative effect on your life, if any at all?
I don't think the war in and of itself as a war had a real direct effect on me, because I didn't serve in the military or wasn't in Vietnam. But I do think that the effect that the Vietnam War had on the country's institutions had an effect on everybody. I mean, the fact that it took so long to end, and the fact that there were shown to be so many cover-ups and lies about it, made everybody distrust government and government institutions for a long time. It certainly led to an unwillingness to project U.S. military power unless there was overwhelming force, and it led to the passage of the War Powers Act in the 1970s. That was an attempt to circumscribe the executive branch's ability to prosecute war without congressional approval.
Right. Thank you very much.